Hello, everyone. My name is Man the Wall,
And I'm Veritas et Caritas.
and welcome to our weekly podcast that we still don't really have a name for. We'll have to figure out one eventually, I guess. So, anyway, last time we did a sort of discussion on the kind of history of BreadTube and why we think it's starting to go on the decline. But since we don't want all of our content to be terminally online, we've decided to talk about another major issue that people actually kind of care about outside of the internet. And that is foreign policy, specifically when not interventions are justified. Would you agree with that, Veritas?
Yes, absolutely. It's a perennial problem, of course, but it's been particularly invoked in recent years with regard to US imperialism and Western interventionism in general.
For sure. Um, would you like to go first, or should I?
You can go first.
Well, thank you, Veritas. So I would say this debate has existed for a long time here in America. Pretty much ever since the United States first decided to really get itself heavily involved in a foreign conflict, that being in 1898 when the United States supported Cuban and Filipino revolutionaries against the Spanish. And it continued into both of the world wars, Cold War, and up to today. I think because for a long time, America was a pretty heavily isolationist country. The founding fathers specifically did not want America to get heavily involved in European politics, or the concert of Europe, as some people would call it. And that's why America, despite the insistence of some, mostly stayed out of the Napoleonic Wars. They did fight, obviously, the War of 1812, but they never actually committed troops to support Napoleon and his efforts, despite the fact that there were some who very much wanted to do so. And then from a while going on, the U.S. was fairly isolationist country in that sense. It didn't really engage in a lot of interventionism, and it also didn't take a whole lot of immigration, although a lot of that was because of, quite frankly, a lot of racist notions about people from certain backgrounds. But after the world wars happened, and America played a decisive role in deciding their outcome, and in the case of the Second World War, dedicated themselves to a morally righteous cause, and in the process managed to rebound their economy and prevent most of Europe from falling under the spear of Soviet influence, which I would say was probably a good thing. People became more accustomed to interventionism, and that remained the case until basically Vietnam. I mean, I've seen a lot of interviews about Vietnam War veterans. A lot of them were like, they grew up in towns where everyone they knew was a World War II or a Korea vet, and they wanted to go because they wanted to be like their parents and grandparents. But when they went onto the battlefield, they found it was much different than they expected. And after that, and after the way that the U.S. government had enforced that conflict, both in the policies it carried out in its attempt to suppress the Viet Cong and attempts to intervene by the North Vietnamese army, and the fact that it had pretty openly lied to its own public for many, many years, people became a lot more skeptical of interventionism, and that kind of notion continued. There were some small interventions, like in Grenada or in Panama or in the Persian Gulf, but there were not any real major wars until the September 11th attacks got people riled up and got people wanting to go and kick in bin Laden's ass and all that, and that resulted in the wars in Afghanistan and indirectly the war in Iraq. And then when those wars didn't go as well as they expected, because as it turns out, nation building is very, very hard and oftentimes doesn't work, there began to become a backlash. And that backlash now is in full swing, as we saw with the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. Although, given the fact that that didn't really turn out so well, it's possible that interventionism may pick up again. Would you agree with that assessment, Veritas, more or less?
I think interventionism is inevitable so long as states have or perceive a vested interest in doing so, sadly.
Yeah, I think that is essentially true. I mean, until we get to like the Star Trek universe where we have like a global United States government, interventionism, invasion, war, conquest, these are imperialism essentially. These are things that seem to be inevitable to just the concept of nation states, more or less. But and I suppose that, since we live in a world of nation states and we live in a world where interventionism is something that will happen, we have to ask ourselves the question, when is it justified and when is it not justified. I'll figure, since I went first this time, I'll hand it over to Veritas and ask him what he thinks about this subject.
I'm interested in this issue, obviously, predominantly from an anarchist perspective, and I've noticed that this issue has been discussed, in particular on Reddit anarchist forums recently. I've participated in some of those discussions. And from an anarchist perspective, I think it is quite difficult to determine exactly what kind of intervention is valid and is actually going to be constructive. Now, it seems to me there are certain ways of viewing intervention which, from some people's perspective, either validate or invalidate the action. Some people seem to think that an intervention which has good results may still be wrong if it is carried out with the wrong agenda or an illegitimate agenda as they see it. For example, somebody might perceive that a particular nation deserves independence, but they believe that if an imperialist power provides that assistance, then it will be necessarily for the good of the imperialist power to assist in their imperialist agenda, which is very likely. And then they would say, well, if assisting these people who want independence would be of value to the imperialist power, then that imperialist nation should not be supporting those people. So in other words, the outcome is invalidated by the intent. Some people seem to take a more pragmatic attitude and say that the outcome is important rather than the intent. Now, to take a couple of real-life situations here, I've been looking at some of the Kavernacle's videos recently, which I do from time to time because I like his content. And he came out very strongly in favor of Taiwanese independence. He believes that the Taiwanese people have the right to self-determination, and they therefore deserve to fight for their independence against China. However, he also made it very clear that he does not believe that anyone should support the Taiwanese struggle for independence. And by support, I'm talking here about military support. He does not believe that any nation should provide military support for Taiwan's struggle for independence. Now, he didn't just say America, which would make sense from an anti-imperialist perspective. He said any nation. He doesn't want any nation supporting Taiwan militarily in their struggle for independence. And he had two reasons for this. Firstly, he believes that it would cause a great deal of conflict with China. It would inevitably result in a significant war, which could possibly escalate to nuclear levels, although I doubt that, which would result in a loss of life. So one of his concerns is humanitarian. He believes that attempting to defend Taiwan in any substantial way would result in a great deal of loss of life, which he would prefer to avoid. And that's comprehensible from a humanitarian perspective. His other reason is that assisting Taiwan in their struggle for independence militarily would preserve, at least in some respects, American interests in Southeast Asia and would contribute significantly to their imperialist agenda in the region. So, although in theory he supports Taiwanese independence, in practice he does not want anybody providing them with the kind of help which would ensure they will become independent, and he does not want an outcome which would be of benefit to American imperialism in the region, which essentially means that in theory he supports Taiwanese independence, but in practice he doesn't want people helping the Taiwanese to make it happen, and he does not want it to actually happen. He would see the outcome as necessarily contributing to American interests and therefore bad. Now, this is quite a conundrum. To my mind, this is like telling the slaves in North America that you agree with their struggle for freedom in theory and you believe that they should be free. However, you do not believe anybody should help them because it could result in a war which would cause a great deal of destruction and a great loss of life, which we know, of course, it actually did. And you might also say, additionally, I think that freeing the slaves would result in a situation of benefit to certain imperialist or capitalist powers. Consequently, although I support your struggle for freedom, actually supporting your struggle for freedom in any substantial way would not only cost a lot of lives, which I don't want, but would also result in a situation of benefit to imperialist or perhaps capitalist interests, and that's something that I don't want. So unfortunately, in practical terms, your struggle, the end result of your struggle, is something that I don't want to see. And I think that's quite a problem.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with you there. Obviously, I understand that it makes some people uncomfortable that the United States is so heavily involved in Southeast Asia. I do wish that America didn't act on these things so unilaterally, and that the attempt to contain, let's say, Chinese influence was more something that was done regionally rather than a superpower from the other side of the world coming in and enforcing it. But the simple reality of the fact is that the Taiwanese army cannot muster the same amount of might, if you will, as the Chinese army. They would be flat. It's just kind of as simple as that. So for that reason, I do support the fact having American soldiers, I believe it's the Marines, but there might be some other branches as well, to be in Taiwan as a means of deterring China from attempting to invade Taiwan. I don't think they'll ever actually do it because I think that ultimately America would probably be willing to go to war to defend it. I think that that's probably worth it to them. But I still think that there should be a military presence in Taiwan for that reason. As far as like sort of general interventionism goes, I've come up with what I like to consider sort of my 3 bullet points, my 3 instances where I believe that an intervention by another country into different countries' affairs could be justified. They are as follows. The first would be active and ongoing genocide. Stuff like what occurred with the Holocaust, stuff like the extermination of Bosnian Muslims and Kosovar Albanians in the Yugoslav wars, the genocide in Rwanda, perhaps the genocide in Cambodia, which Vietnam brought to an end with its invasion of that country. I'm trying to think of some others, but I think that's generally the idea that I would be okay with either another nation or more ideally the United Nations, like a broad coalition coming in, preventing that genocide from happening, giving protection to the people who might be affected by this. The second case for me would be an active, open, like inarguable, aggressive invasion. This would be stuff like, for example, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, or when Indonesia invaded East Timor, or if China were to invade Taiwan. Because I do believe that nations have the right, if not to sovereignty at least, they have the right to not be ruled by a foreign power who they have no interest in being ruled by. And because of that, I would be in favor of kicking that power out of that region if they were to invade it.
Right.
And the third one, possibly the most controversial, but I think I would stand by it on the same, is when a democratically elected government is violently deposed and replaced by an authoritarian one. And the reason that I would endorse this is because I'm a big believer in democracy, and that the idea that the will of the people should be the one that is respected, and if that is being violated, I think that it is justifiable to try to assist people into reclaiming that
Right.
government. Also, because generally speaking, authoritarian governments have worse outcomes for people who live under it. So there is I think a equal, if not, as far as like cost benefit analysis goes, I think that those things balance out, or we might actually in the long term save more lives by invading and replacing the authoritarian government with a democratically elected one, assuming it's deposed. Examples of this might be the United States intervention in Grenada. Let's say hypothetically, let's say the Soviet Union invaded Chile during the coup in the 70s. I would basically consider that to be more or less acceptable. Okay, you go for a second.
Yeah, the topic of genocide, it's something that has come up on anarchist subreddits as well, several times, I've been having a look at some of the previous discussions and some of the current discussion, actually, some discussion I was involved in recently. And there are several unfortunate challenges, even with the idea of saying, well, intervention is justified in the case of genocide. Firstly, there's the issue of what defines genocide. And after that, there's the issue of determining whether or not genocide is actually taking place in the region and what kind of genocide it is. And, for example, if it's a physical genocide, destroying people literally, or if it's a cultural genocide aimed at destruction of people's culture. So after that, then, of course, there's the question of who should intervene and what intervention should look like. And I've noticed leftists seem kind of split on the issue of intervention with regard to genocide, which seems like it would be unusual, but obviously there are some important reasons for that. For example, a lot of leftists are not happy with the fact that Western powers intervened to stop the Serbian genocide. And there are several reasons for that. One of them is simple anti-imperialism. The further, I find, generally speaking, the further east you go, the more leftist resistance to intervention in the Serbian genocide increases. And when I say east, I mean geographically east. So I find that Eastern European leftists exhibit stronger and stronger opposition to Western intervention in the Serbian genocide. Now, that's understandable from the perspective that the further east you go, the greater consciousness there is of Western imperialism in Europe over Eastern European nations. And, of course, that's comprehensible. And, of course, there's also a concern about Eastern European self-determination itself, and the idea that Western intervention in Eastern European affairs necessarily stifles and prevents that agenda. On the other hand, there's also just a general anti-Western sentiment, I find, the further you go in the East. Now, I've actually had conversations about the Serbian genocide with a Serbian leftist that I know, and he's completely against the Western intervention in the Serbian genocide. He will agree that the Serbian genocide was wrong, although he typically doesn't talk about it as a genocide. He says that some very bad things happen in Serbia, is about as far as he's prepared to go. He sees it as a greater evil that the West intervene. So on the anniversary of the NATO strikes against the Serbs, you'll find he sometimes makes posts decrying the Western intervention and lamenting the civilians who were killed in the NATO bombing campaigns. And he is completely against the idea that people should have intervened in the Serbian genocide. I think partly he sees it as simply Serbian domestic business, which wasn't anybody else's business. And secondly, of course, he sees it as just an example of Western imperialism. He actually argues that nobody in the West really cared about the genocide. They were just using it as an excuse to crush Serbia. And he also believes that there's this ongoing campaign to stamp out leftism in Eastern European countries. He's, I think, probably a Marxist-Leninist, technically, very, very in favor of the Soviet Union, very in favor of the Soviet Union's annexation of Eastern European states, very in favor of the Soviet Union maintaining control over the Eastern European states and preventing them from breaking away. So very against the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and ironically also very against independence of those Baltic state nations from the Soviet Union. So ironically, he talks about Serbian independence and self-determination on the one hand, while on the other hand, he thinks that the Eastern European nations which the USSR annexed should not have broken away and shouldn't have been permitted to break away. But that's a contradiction I just don't have the time to investigate or challenge him with. He's very, very touchy on the issue of the Serbian genocide, as I mentioned, typically doesn't describe it as a genocide. And I think that he's symptomatic of reasons why people are against the idea of intervention, because they see the cure as worse than the illness. And I think he also attributes that Western interventionism to Serbia's current economic woes and socio-economic woes. I think he believes that, well, ever since the Western powers intervened, Serbia's been going badly, and it's all the fault of those people who intervened in that thing that was happening that we won't call a genocide. Apart from that, I've seen that, of course, there's discussion of the Rwandan genocide. Now, the West intervened very late in the Rwandan genocide. In fact, you could pretty much say that UN intervention only took place well after it had started, and even arguably after at least most of it had already ended. And this is obviously a very sore spot with the Rwandans. You'll find official Rwandan records expressing great bitterness over the Western reluctance to get involved and how difficult it was to convince UN staff and committees that genocide was actually happening and that something had to be done, and that it had to be done so promptly, and that it required military intervention. And this raises another problem. If a nation is actively requesting military intervention in their affairs, should their request be granted? Should people get involved? That's obviously a question which is going to be answered differently according to people's different perspectives. And I think that some people would say, well, nobody should get involved if they have another vested interest. Nobody should get involved if they are not getting involved for reasons other than humanitarian ones, if they are motivated by other concerns. I'm afraid that's going to leave a very short list of people to get involved on the one hand, and on the other hand, I don't know how you could possibly police that kind of restriction on involvement. Additionally, if the only people willing to get involved are nations with a vested interest, and you don't want anybody getting involved who has a vested interest, that means nobody is allowed to get involved. And that means you tell people like the Rwandans, well, sorry, but there are some people who could get involved. There are some people who could send military aid, but, they have vested interests and they're imperialist nations and they probably have an imperialist agenda. So unfortunately, even if they did stop your genocide, it would be for the wrong reasons. And consequently, it's better that nobody intervenes and we just let this genocide thing play out, because that's going to be better than people stopping the genocide with the wrong motivation. So I don't know, what do you do with that?
Well, for one, I disagree with it.
Yeah, right.
Frankly, the idea that the United States' involvement in Kosovo was somehow worse than what Serbia did is ridiculous. The United States killed what was it, 5,000 people? Maybe no, it was less than even that. Let me look this up. Yeah, they killed 1,500 people, and the Serbs killed 10,000 Kosovars over the course of half a year. They were way worse.
Right. Yeah. Not to mention the refugee crisis.
Yeah, it was completely insane. And as far as the Rwandan genocide, I mean, at the end of the day, my main sort of goal with any of this is to maximize people's well-being and happiness in general, and to prevent harm from coming to people. That is kind of my axiomatic value, as I imagine is the same for you. If that means interventionism at that point, then I guess for me, the answer is so be it. I don't necessarily adhere to this idea of, well, we shouldn't get involved because why? Because principles? I don't know. That just doesn't matter to me as much.
Yes.
It's human lives and stuff, So I think on that front, we absolutely agree. Was there anything else you wanted to say about the other two points that I mentioned, or not really?
No, not really. I'm incredibly conflicted on this issue myself as an anarchist, because anarchists tend to be non-intervention, generally speaking. We believe in mutual aid. We do believe in intervention on the behalf of an oppressed minority or an oppressed weaker power which is being coerced. So we do believe in resistance to coercion. So from that perspective, anarchists would say, and you can see this on Reddit channels, for example, anarchists would support other anarchists providing material aid or raising awareness of particular issues, or even actually going physically to the location and helping out. Although for most anarchists, that's pretty impractical. And if you were going to get on a plane and go to Rwanda in the middle of a genocide, you'd have to really seriously think what material aid you as an individual could actually provide.
Yeah, that is true, unfortunately.
It gets more complicated when you bring in concerns about white saviorism, white man's burden, and the extent to which white people should be involved in non-white business anyway, which, again, a lot of people, and you'll find in this case in non-white leftist circles, people are very skeptical of, with obviously good historical reasons, but it does mean that as an anarchist, you're kind of left there thinking, okay, so what am I supposed to do? Or are you telling me that you would just rather me do nothing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that perspective is understandable, but I also just don't think it's correct. I mean, granted, like, let's say that the United Nations did intervene in the Rwandan genocide. It probably would have been better just for, like, optics' sake to involve mostly African soldiers and not, like, European ones. Because then the Hutu government could say, oh, the European colonizers, they're coming back in, they're going to make Rwanda a colony again, and that could rifle up fear in the population and make them more likely to trust them. So, that is definitely an issue. But I don't really have a problem with it principally, I guess now we have to also talk about, like, when intervention is probably not justified, because there have been plenty of times where it isn't. I would say, generally speaking, places where we should not involved, even if there is legitimate oppression being involved, are cases where a delicate balance of power wrong in basically like keg. So let me give you an example. Hypothetically, that the Soviet Union and its allies, Africa, in the 80s, they overthrew the apartheid regime. They established the ANC in power. They have to deal with how they're going to manage all the different types of people who live in South Africa, all the different tribes of that balance work. And more often than not, it probably will not. I think ultimately, if that had happened, it would have resulted in some kind of further civil war, either between like white settlers and the newly established black government, and or the newly established black government and rebelling tribes like the Zulus who want to establish more autonomy for themselves, essentially. That would be one example. I mean, the exact same thing happened in Iraq, more or less. The second would be, I would say, when it comes to general civil wars, like wars between warlords in Africa, I don't think we should really try to pick a side in that kind of conflict. We should probably try to push for peace instead. And this is the third one. This one's very important. Supporting anti-democratic or authoritarian governments, which the United States has done many times, whether it be in South Vietnam, in Indonesia, in basically all of Latin America, in the Congo, in the Philippines, in South Korea. We really shouldn't do that. Like, that's really bad. It makes the rest of the world resent us. It helps bad regimes stay in power. It's not good, but we keep doing it because it's in our financial interest to do so. So yeah, those would be my examples of when interventionism is not justified.
Yeah. Okay. I'll add a couple of points to that. Speaking of unjustified intervention, again, returning to one of the Kavernacle's videos, he was raising the issue of Afghanistan and, of course, the Western intervention in Afghanistan. And he was saying, look, I think that we shouldn't have been in there. And, of course, what he was saying was that he thinks that the motivation for entering was wrong and the execution was also wrong, the way that the intervention was carried out. And he said that he believed if the Western powers had been involved in ways in addition to or other than simple military intervention, they could have done a much better job. What if they'd been spending money on infrastructure? What if they'd been building civic services? This kind of thing. Maybe they should have been doing that. Now, ironically, they were actually doing that. In fact, a very large amount of money was spent over that time specifically on infrastructure and civic services and things like that. So actually that was being done. And he also said that there needs to be some kind of coalition building with local people, getting to know their needs and their culture and this kind of thing. And again, that kind of thing was actually done. But unfortunately, a lot of this aid was sadly wasted, partly as a result of local corruption and partly as a result, it must be said, of simply US incompetence and lack of oversight and insufficient efforts to overcome the local corruption. But that aside, he raised the analogous case of the British intervention in India and their attempt to suppress the traditional Hindu practice of sati, which required widows to kill themselves on the death of their husband. This was typically, though not always, carried out by the wife placing herself alive on her husband's funeral pyre as her husband's body was being burned, and so slowly burning to death while alive herself. And the Kavernacle argued that Britain should not have been intervening in the suppression of sati in the way that they did. He didn't say technically they shouldn't intervene at all, but he said that the way they went about it was wrong. He said you can't just go into a country and blanket outlaw their established cultural practices, which are very important to them, even if you disagree with them. Blanket bans just don't work. This kind of prohibition, making it illegal overnight, isn't a good idea. You need to collaborate with the local people. You need to consult with them. You need to work with established activists who are already involved in the struggle. Britain should have been involved with local people. They should have been looking for activists who were already trying to stop this practice and work at a ground roots level with these people. And they should not have banned it outright. They should not have banned it overnight, because that doesn't really solve anything. Now, again, the fact is that Britain did that. In fact, ironically, when the British first entered India, they weren't concerned with issues like sati. And in actual fact, local activists and certain local leaders petitioned the British for intervention and aid in trying to stamp out sati. And for a number of years, the British just didn't get involved. They just didn't think it was an issue that they had any responsibility for. So in actual fact, there were people, local activists, local people on the ground who were trying already to stamp out the practice and who believed that they could harness the authority and power of the British in their struggle. Now, this is a classic example of complex collusion between the colonialized and their colonizers, or the imperialists on the one hand, and those over whom they rule on the other. The history of colonization and imperialism is always more complex when we take into account the frequent collusion, for whatever reason, of the colonizers and those they colonize. So in this case, there were activists who were already trying to stamp out the practice, and they were petitioning the British to try and help them, and they wanted the British to give them legal and military aid in order to try and stamp out this practice. And at first, the British were reluctant to do so. So, ironically, the Kavernacle framed this as the British just going into India, seeing it as a backwards and primitive place, catching hold of an issue like sati to try and justify this stereotype of the Indians as backward savages who needed civilization, and then using that as a justification for imperialism. Now, in reality, imperialism had already happened, and the British hadn't been using issues like sati to justify it. They didn't think they needed to justify it at all. Now, it is true, however, that later on, as British resistance to imperialism in India grew, it is true that some British leaders did use the supposedly heathen primitive religion of Hinduism and practices such as sati as justification for continued imperialism and British interventionism. But it's more complex than that, because at the same time, there were as I said, grassroots people in India attempting to get the British involved in this. And as I said, initially, the British were not getting involved. They were reluctant to get involved. And when they finally did get involved, ironically, they were very successful, at least in some regions. So they were actually dragged into this issue by local people themselves. Now, in addition to that, there is the complex relationship of British feminism and this issue. And while it is true, of course, that there were definitely British feminists who would have seen this as just an example of why India was a backwards, primitive country which needed civilization, there was also a broader issue which was raised by British feminists, and that was that if they wanted to be consistent in fighting for feminism and women's rights in Britain, they could not withhold their support from the suppression of Sati and from the campaigns to suppress Sati. It would have been inconsistent in their regard to fight for feminism only for British women and refuse to fight for what they perceived as a feminist cause for women in India. So again, there's this complex interplay of interests, and a lot of the feminists in Britain who were supporting the anti-Sati campaign in India were doing so because they rightly perceived that if they did not, it would not only weaken their own campaign for feminism in Britain, it would also demonstrate that they didn't really have any regard for international feminism, and they were only fighting for the interests of relatively already privileged middle and upper class women, which is where, of course, the feminist, or the early modern feminist movement in Britain started. So the issue is a lot more complex than the Kavernacle actually thought, and I'm thinking of making a video on this because it illustrates the difficulty with interventionism and, of course, the difficulty of disentangling interventionist history. Now, not only that, I want to pick up on the Kavernacle's idea that it was a bad idea to outright ban Sati. You know, the idea that, well, yes, it's probably not a good thing, but you can't just make it illegal overnight and expect that to work. You've got to do these things slowly, and you've got to talk to people who are actually doing this and understand them better. And you know, you've got to take into consideration their feelings as well and think about, well, you don't want to displease these people and or disrupt their ancient cultural practices when you're just coming along as an outsider. You don't really understand what this is about anyway. You know, you might see that widows being burned alive is a bad thing, but they don't see it that way. You've just got a biased Western perspective. They don't see it that way, and it really might not be your business. But even if you do want to intervene, then you can't just ban it overnight and expect that to fix the problem, and you shouldn't take such instant extreme measures. You should take a much, much longer period to try and gradually diminish the practice. And again, ironically, the British did actually try this. In 1798, they placed a conditional ban on Sati, and between 1813 and 1829, they attempted to regulate it with additional moderate legislation, differentiating between Sati committed with consent and Sati committed without consent. So they did actually try to regulate it for at least 10 years without banning it outright, and of course, that didn't work. But I'm wondering if he would say the same for an issue like slavery. Imagine telling a slave in North America, well, you know, we could ban slavery. Sure, we could ban slavery in this state. But, you know, that is going to upset a lot of slave owners. And I think it's going to be better if we take the time to listen to their perspective and just, give it a few years. We've got to understand them. This is something that's been going on for a long time. And, I know it's uncomfortable for you, but you've got to consider their perspective. And, you know, banning things overnight never really works. You can't just ban slavery and then expect that, well, now we'll just enforce the ban and things will work. You can't just do that overnight. You've got to do this stuff gradually. You know, go from slavery to maybe just like slightly less slavery, and then maybe just give black people a few more rights. But, you know, you got to make people wait. You got to make people wait for this stuff until everybody's ready to move forward. Now, that was tried in the US, and it didn't get anywhere. And the number of compromises which were made to slave owners actually resulted only in emboldening them. And as we know, all of the compromises that were made were breached by slavery supporters and slave owners who simply took advantage of this not only to maintain slavery in their own region, but attempt to spread slavery to already anti-slavery states in direct defiance of various agreements. So I really question that approach, but it does demonstrate, again, the extent to which even leftists struggle quite considerably with these issues.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's actually pretty interesting. I know we had talked about that before, about the Sati stuff, but you never gone into that much detail. It does seem like I would probably say that as far as like what I would have done if I was in charge, I would say, yeah, I would be okay with outlawing Sati, just like full stop. I understand that these things can be difficult, but I mean, for the many crimes that Britain committed against India, and they committed a lot, that was, in my opinion, was not necessarily one of them. And I think you make
Yeah, I mean, ironically, opposition in India to the ban of Sati came from, of course, powerful conservative Hindu groups who explicitly made the argument that this was the intervention of an imperialist colonizing power in local religious matters that simply did not involve them, and they even claimed that it was a breach of British law to march into a country like this and start fooling around with their religion and their sacred traditions. So they weren't unaware of these kind of counter arguments. And yeah, I mean, what are you going to say? Who was in the right? The widow burning people or the people trying to stop them? And you might say, well, you know, generally I'd say I'm probably against widow burning, but I don't think they went about it in the right way. Well, they were going about it in the way that was requested of them by local Indian reformers and activists. And so, yes, maybe those reformers and activists were wrong. Maybe they should have taken a much slower approach. Maybe they should have just let, say, okay, well, but how about we just put a cap on the number of widows we're going to burn this year, and kind of maybe every year or so we'll see if we can just whittle that number down a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know what was a better alternative. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely sure either. I think that you're right. I think that, like, obviously, like, I understand why people are kind of hesitant about that, because to some extent, like say, like, it could potentially be interpreted as kind of like a white man's burden idea of like, oh, we go to all these countries and prevent them from doing backwards, like, fucked up, terrible shit. And like, look, I mean, countries have autonomy, but like, for example, I'm okay with, for example, the United States making moves to pressure countries that into, for example, being less anti-LGBT or being like less misogynist as far as its laws and social structure. I think that these are perfectly fine things, and these are things that frankly should be done. And I know this sounds cynical. I don't really care as much that some people might interpret it as a colonialist approach on their nation, because the alternative is worse. I'd like people to not have that notion, obviously. I think there are ways we can circumvent it by making sure that the actual people on the ground, whether it be women in the third world or LGBT people in the third world, have a voice in our attempt to, say, decriminalize homosexuality or criminalize marital rape, or to encourage less socially restrictive and conservative social principles, saying like, hey, we shouldn't make hijabs or burqas mandatory or whatever. These are just random examples, but you get my point. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I think in that case we pretty much agree. That is an interesting point. I would be interested in seeing you do a response to the Kavernacle. I'm not sure if you would respond, but it would be interesting.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think he would. I mean, he has a lot of followers, and he has quite a few people responding to him from time to time. I just don't think he has the time.
Yeah, probably not.
I did post on his subreddit very briefly in response to a few comments he had about Taiwan and independence, and we kind of respectfully disagreed. And he said, look, and I said, I would like to make a video on this, and I'd like to contact you privately about it first. And we had a bit of a public exchange. And then he said, look, I think most of what I've already said on this topic should be pretty clear from my initial comments, and the rest should be clear from this other video in which I clarified my comments in a very long stream. And I watched that video and I said, yeah, okay. And he said, look, I think I've said everything in those videos, so if you want to make a response, just go ahead. But he did get a lot of pushback from very many people regarding his views on Taiwan in particular, and there's no way he would have been able to respond to all of them. And I think would be the case if I made a video on his views on Mutiny and Afghanistan, which I probably will, but I definitely don't expect him to respond. The guy just has too many people to deal with, too many people responding to him already. So
yeah,
when you're a streamer as big as he is, and when you have a lot of content like that, I mean, you have to prioritize.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, certainly. That is very interesting, though. I guess, I mean, we had one other topic that we wanted to get to before we were done. I guess if I were to make closing statements on interventionism, I would say, generally speaking, my principle with interventionism is that I'm a utilitarian. If I believe that an intervention causes more good to the world than bad, then I will support it. And if it causes more bad than good, I won't. There are some people who take a kind of principled anti-imperialist stance, like they will not support any action by a big power against a smaller power, even if they're doing something terrible, because they view that as a violation of that country's sovereignty. Or in some cases, they might view it as a violation of international law. But while I do think that in some cases those are legitimate concerns, I believe that it is a more important concern to make sure that people are not suffering under the boots of repressive, authoritarian, or violent regime.
Right.
That's sort of my perspective. Do you both more or less agree?
As an anarchist, I'm always interested predominantly in the safety and concerns of the marginalized, oppressed group, and in overthrowing all the hierarchies that are causing oppression. I always believe that individuals, particularly those who are explicitly suffering under oppression and who are declaring their suffering, announcing their suffering, and are, in some cases at least, requesting aid and requesting intervention, need to be helped. Exactly what form that help has to take should always be determined in very close consultation with those individuals, and definitely not taken unilaterally by outside parties. But generally speaking, I am in favor of intervening in some way, whatever way, which is going to be useful to overthrow those oppressive hierarchies and to deliver the marginalized and oppressed.
Yeah, in that case, it seems like we more or less agree. Going on to our next topic, we wanted to talk a little bit about, it was about a day ago, some of you probably know about this, the popular YouTube and Twitch streamer Vosh, who both of us have talked plenty about, both in private and on this stream, had a debate with Relevant about the controversy surrounding Hassan Piker, one of the world's most popular Twitch streamers, using the money that he amassed from his Twitch streaming to buy a $3 million house. The issue for some people is that Hassan is a socialist, and therefore, hypothetically, the fact that he spends his money in such a kind of luxurious and, I don't want to say reckless, but, in a way that is not necessarily helping other people, it's more in a more self-serving way, I guess you could say, is hypocritical for him as a socialist.
I would say if you want to, I would say perhaps you might say a self-centered way or a self-focused way.
Yeah.
That might be better.
This backlash came from a lot of different people. It came from, obviously, a lot of people on the right. I remember Vosh covered Ben Shapiro's reaction to the Hassan house buying thing, which admittedly I have not seen, and I don't particularly have any interest in seeing that. It's been a pretty big story, and I guess the question of the hour is, does it matter that Hassan bought a $3 million house? Is it unethical for him to do that as a socialist? Is it contradictory to his values? Should he be doing something different? If so, what should he be doing? And I think that's an interesting discussion for us to get into. I imagine you'd agree there, Toss.
Yeah, and as an anarchist myself, I believe very strongly in praxis, and I do appreciate especially the fact that a lot of people level the accusation towards leftists that they are all talk and not enough action. And I can understand that. I'd like to make the point that there are a lot of people online, a lot of leftists online, who are probably engaged in a lot of action that is simply not visible online. And they don't particularly draw attention to it online, and they don't make it visible online. And I don't think they have to either. I don't agree with self-promotion just out of principle, quite apart from anything else. But I do believe that any leftist who is worthy of the name should be performing the kind of praxis which they're able to do. Basically, you should be doing as much as you can wherever you are, as often as possible.
Yeah. So as far as kind of my perspective on this issue, I'll be honest. I don't really care that much that Hassan bought a nice house. Good for him, I guess. I don't necessarily believe, a lot of people were like, hey, well, Hassan is a socialist, but he makes a lot of money. It's being a socialist doesn't mean that you can't make a lot of money. Karl Marx in Das Kapital didn't write about one of the crucial tenets of socialism is not making money. That wouldn't even make sense for him because he made a lot of money, and so did Engels.
Right. Obviously, it's about your relationship to the means of production. If you're making a lot of money by virtue of owning the means of production and exploiting other people, that is a problem. If, on the other hand, you own the means of production, you're essentially self-employed, and you're making your money as a result of your own labor instead of anybody else's, that's a very different matter.
Yes, I would agree with that. Although I don't necessarily, since I'm not explicitly a leftist, I'm a social democrat. I don't believe that. I don't believe that it's necessarily wrong to, for example, to own the
related
means of
to the means of production.
I do agree that there is a fundamental difference.
Right.
The one thing that I do think is legitimate is I do think this isn't even necessarily just a socialist thing. It's more just a practical thing. I think if you have a reasonable amount of money, you should probably dedicate a reasonable amount of it to helping people who are less fortunate than you. I think that's just part of being a decent human being. And I'm not saying that he has to spend literally every single penny on praxis and stuff. That would be silly, of course, but I think that there's stuff that you could do. Maybe at the end of every stream, for example, he might do hey guys, here's some charity shout out, or here's some shout out to some candidate that I think you should donate to. It doesn't even have to be political. It could just be hey, here's a link to a charity that I don't know, helps provide water to children in Africa or something like that, or that helps war veterans get back on their feet when they return home from combat, or whatever. I just think that would be, if he were to do that, and if he were to, even better, if he were to maybe dedicate himself and a bit of his money to actually addressing the systemic issues as to why we have issues with things like, say, poverty or world hunger or lack of clean water or lack of proper education or healthcare or mistreatment of veterans or poor people or whatever, to actually make attempts to, whether by funding candidates who support legislation that would do this or by lobbying for it or whatever. I think if he did that as well, that would be great as well.
Yeah, and I have seen, of course, the typical questions raised whenever anybody says, well, why isn't Hassan doing more socialist stuff or being more socialist? A couple of the typical responses are, well, firstly, what do you think he should be doing that he isn't doing now? And secondly, how much of it do you think he is doing? Well, of course, in answer to the first question, I don't know exactly what he is doing now, so I can't speak to that. But I could talk about the kind of things that I think that he could be doing, which I would think might be useful. For example, starting a workers' co-op or contributing regularly to a specific charity or something like that. And then, of course, with regard to the question of how much should he be doing, well, my answer to that is the same answer I would give myself. We should always do as much as we can within specific practical limits, which we determine by ourselves. So I'd say that's how much he does is entirely his own business. But I would say that he should be doing something.
Yeah, I agree.
And I don't doubt that he already is doing something. I don't doubt that he's already involved in some things.
Yeah, but
I suspect he is not as involved as some people, and I suspect that he isn't doing things on the kind of scale that he perhaps could be doing them on. Now, with regard to that, particularly with regard to scale, I do also appreciate the perspective that, as a lot of activists will say, well, okay, but honestly, you have to look at the sheer scale of systemic issues in our country. They're on such a scale that individual intervention, individual assistance is practically insignificant. I mean, we've got issues in, say, this city alone, which would take not just a few $1,000s a month, but hundreds of millions of dollars a year to change significantly. And I totally get that. And of course, there's a lot of activism burnout resulting from people realizing that the sheer scale of systemic issues is enormous and extremely difficult for even large activist groups to address, and practically impossible for individuals to address. However, having said that, I do believe that some improvement is better than doing nothing. And obviously, while systemic issues are beyond the capacity of a single individual to alter significantly, unless they are phenomenally wealthy or have enormous amounts of socio-political power, people's lives could be improved significantly with smaller scale acts which could still make a distinctive difference. And there are a host of examples of these kind of small activist projects which are very useful. And of course, as I said, apart from anything else, you could simply donate to local activist groups in your area and become maybe a sponsor or patron of at least one specific activist group or social welfare organization, and enhance significantly their ability to carry out their mission. I think that's something that would be entirely legitimate, and that's something that, frankly, I would expect somebody who professes to be a socialist to be doing.
Yeah, I basically entirely agree. I think that, unfortunately, because a lot of the criticism against Hassan for the house stuff has kind of been boiled down to these kind of meme level talking points of, haha, you're a socialist, but you got like a decent house. I remember Hassan put out like this GIF that was admittedly pretty funny. Here, let me look for it. It was a picture of Karl Marx, and it was a quote, and it was like, socialism is when Hassan has no house, or something like that. I mean, on one hand, like, it's like, to me, it's just kind of unfortunate that because of that, he's probably not going to take any of the more serious criticism that, like, hey, dude, at this point, you probably make a pretty enormous amount of money. I mean, I didn't see the Twitch leaks. I don't know exactly how much he makes, but I mean, it's well into 7, maybe even 8 figures at this point. So, I like, at that point, I'd be pretty comfortable saying, like, okay, you've got enough spare income. Maybe we like spend at least a decent chunk of that on. I mean, it could be anything. It doesn't even have to be like local stuff. It could be like donating to like charities that help people in the third world. I mean, that's kind of the thing that I immediately go to, because kind of they seem to be the people who are kind of screwed over the worst. But beyond that, or like helping with, anything like, domestic violence or preventing child abuse, like whatever, just generally helping people. I think like that would just be like a good thing to do. Or, he could do canvassing. He could maybe try to push for certain policies that might, say, reduce some of the institutional problems that we see in the world. Like maybe he could try making a case for like eliminating third world debt, for instance.
Right.
That might be something that could be helpful to people living in poverty over there. Or advocating that corporations that use manual labor overseas provide better conditions for the workers who live in those places, or anything like that. I think that would be a perfectly legitimate and fair criticism of it. And I don't want to spend too much time on talking about like the Bosch relevant debate, because you can see it. To be honest, it was frankly kind of a shit show. My main issue was that like Vosh didn't seem to actually want to respond to the actual ideas that Al Relevant was presenting. He just kind of wanted to hit him with like an allegation of like, oh, you're being a hypocrite because you don't criticize like other people who aren't socialists for having a double standard when it comes to what they say and how much they actually spend. And his response was, well, given the fact that he is a socialist, I would say he has more of an obligation to do so, which I do more or less agree with, though I think everyone who is in a more fortunate position to try to help those that are less fortunate, obviously. So yeah, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, optics are not everything, and I totally agree with the people who make the point that arguments over optics are very often used to veil illegitimate criticism. or to distract from more important issues. Having said which, if you have an income of $200,000 a year, I heard that cited for Hassan. I don't know if that's true, so I'm not saying that's what he earns.
I think it's way more than that, honestly. It's probably like, I'd have to look it up.
Okay.
But...
Well, all right. Well,
yeah.
If you have an income of, for example, $200,000 a year, and your living expenses are well covered by that, and you end up with a significant surplus, I believe you should be doing what you can to use that surplus as effectively as possible in the cause of social aid and social welfare as effectively as you can. And if you're not sure how you should do it, then you should talk to people in your local area, at least, who could give you some guidance. As I said, I believe everybody should do as much as they can wherever they are, as often as possible. And for leftists, I think that's just a sine qua non.
Yeah, more or less. So I'm trying to think, is there anything else that we didn't get to? I kind of feel like we covered just about everything.
Yeah, pretty much. Definitely everything I think that we wanted to cover today.
Yeah, for sure. So we'll be doing these every week. We don't really have a name for them yet. We might have to come up with something like that. But until next week, I'm Man the Wall.
And I'm Veritas et Caritas.
And we'll see you next time.
Finally, I'd like to thank my generous patrons: Elias Asfig, Duran Barnett, Alexander Curzon, Shawnee Young, Andy Chaos, Tibby LTP, Thors, Niels Rethlin, Judge Sabo, Matthew Simrell, Thomas Leonard, Martin T, Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Jack C, Ezekiel Stacey, Love You More, Noah French, Aaron Johnson, and Dusty Bob. Please contact me directly if I ever pronounce your name wrong. Thank you.